Today's interview will be with Lucy Strange, the writer, and I learnt a lot from this interview. We had a lot of tech problems at the beginning, which Lucy actually managed to sort out. I've never actually had this before, so if it sounds a little bit chaotic at the beginning, that's why. But have a listen to this, because there's some great stuff in here about creativity and organising yourself as a writer. So without further ado. Great.
Okay.
So here we go. This has been an interesting beginning. Right. So on today's programme, I have Lucy Strange.
I think we should talk mainly about the technical challenges faced by creatives.
I do think that's a point that we need to discuss at some point. Yeah. Okay, Lucy. Right. We shall talk about what the problem was in a minute. So I've got a traditional first question, Lucy, which is, what do you do? Hello.
What do I do? Well, I'm a writer. I'm a children's author. I came to it a bit later on in my life. So excuse me. I was probably about mid-30s when I started writing properly, having spent a lifetime as a bookworm, as a reader, and doing all sorts of other things, which perhaps we can talk about in due course. But I started writing for me, I think, and then I started to think about whether it might be something that I could make a career out of. And then my first book came out in 2016, and my fifth book has just come out. So I've been a busy bee, and I've been writing full time now. I've been writing professionally as my sole source of income for about last 2 years. Sort of, it was a gradual shift across.
Okay, so you said you were a bookworm. So let's go back to that, because I always like to go back to the beginning.
Yeah.
So that's like, you've always been a bookworm.
Always, I just loved stories. There's a photo that I've got. I talk in schools a lot these days. And one of the things that I often show them is a photo of me as a 2-year-old reading a Mr. Man story to my baby brother. I couldn't actually read, of course. I did that thing that lots of toddlers do, where they just know their favourite stories off by heart, and they turn the page, they recite it out loud. So I'd always just loved stories. I just read. I was just one of those kids that just devours books. The choice of books when I was a youngster, the choice of age-appropriate books, now I look back, and in comparison with what the industry's like now, was pretty thin, actually. And there were probably maybe about 50 titles in my public library that were the right sort of I suppose the right sort of register for me, the right sort of stories for my age group. And I just used to read the same books over and over again. And then I got bored of them and started reading adult books. And there wasn't, there wasn't the fantastic, really fantastic range of books that are available now. But I wasn't particularly tempted to write. I used to do the creative writing that we do at school. I wrote some really bad love poetry as a teenager, which I think is something we all have to do. It's very important, I think, rite of passage. I dabbled a bit, but I never really felt. I never really felt it was very good. When I did do bits of writing, and I do think with some art forms, you just sort of have to wait for your brain to be ripe to do it. I did feel like I needed a certain amount of life experience to write, because I've read so much. developed, got quite a good taste. I studied English literature at university. I developed a taste and a sense of what I thought worked and what was good and resonant and important and significant in terms of literature and worth reading. So I had a really high bar, and I and I knew for a long time that I'd never get anywhere close to writing something that I thought was actually good enough. And then, so I think around about my mid-30s, I came back to it, and I was living abroad at the time, and I was living in the Middle East and teaching. I was an English teacher at this point, and feeling very, very homesick. It was actually quite a difficult time in my life, and I honestly think I started writing as a sort of therapy, I suppose. It was a way of thinking about home. I was writing my first book, Secret of Nightingale Wood, which I didn't know it was going to be my first book at the time. I was just playing with an idea, really. And it's a very nostalgic story. There's a lot of England in it and a lot about nature and all these things I missed. Living in the Middle East, obviously, I was living in an apartment in a desert, and I'm someone that I love the British outdoors. I love green stuff and forests and that wet smell after rain and all that kind of thing. And I really ached. I longed for this. So it's not, my first book isn't a story about homesickness. It wasn't that literal. It was, but there's definitely a sense of loss and a sense of longing. And it just, I suppose it just tapped into something inside me, and I just started writing. I entered a writing competition, and through that I got a literary agent. And through that, I sold my first book and got my first contract with a publisher, and then began the very, very interesting process and really quite a grueling process of becoming a writer, because of course, playing with ideas and that quite sort of therapeutic writing for the self is very, very different from writing something that have commercial prospects and writing for an actual readership. So we had to, I went through my incredible editor who I worked with at my publisher Chicken House. My editor's called Rachel Leishan, very experienced editor, really, and we were a very good match. We both have the same sort of aims and tastes and understandings of the stories and character and so on. But she put me through a kind of writer's boot camp. My first full draft of Nightingale Wood was 106,000 words, and what ended up being published was 60,000 words. So we cut, almost half, a huge amount of words we had to cut. And of course, it's not, it was a ripping apart process. It was taking out whole plot threads, whole storylines, whole characters, whole chapters being ripped out, and then that process of having to sort of stitch it all back together again, and you end up with something that feels like a sort of a Frankenstein's monster of a story. And it's got to be seamless. It's got, those stitches have got to be invisible. And working so hard on that, and at the same time as that intellectual challenge, all my stories have got kind of mysteries and clues and that sort of thing. So making that all still work was a huge. It's like playing 3D chess. You change something here, and then the implications are lateral as well as longitudinal. It's all incredibly difficult. But the emotional side of editing and dealing with someone saying, we need to get rid of this, let's cut that, and it's something that you might have spent weeks on, or a character that I really loved, a scene I was really proud of. And it's something I took when I talk to sort of workshops and things these days. And one of the main things I talk about is that kind of resilience that you have to develop if you want to make, if you actually want to sell what you're doing, because you've got to take all these commercial considerations into account. You've got to think about your audience, and you've got to make some really tough choices along the way. And for me, sometimes when I get feedback from an editor, I go through this like a sort of miniature stages of grief kind of thing. My instant reaction is always defensive, or even now it's always defensive. But back then, I wasn't quite as savvy, and I'd get quite emotional about it. But now I know the best thing to do is just to read the feedback, read all of it, get out of the way, and then just let myself stew on it. Wait for all those negative feelings of kind of defensiveness and anger and so on to subside, and then inevitably I end up getting actually quite excited about the creative challenge ahead of what. So if we're taking that character out, there's a gap. What happens with that? How are we going to make that work, and so on. But it's been a real roller coaster for me, and learning so much about, as I say, not just about the craft of writing, but about managing myself and I think my expectations of what a creative career is in a professional way.
Yes. I mean, you've covered a lot there, and I can go.
Yeah, sorry, I monologued a bit there.
That's great. It's great because that is one of the things that obviously creative people will have a real problem with, because it's something of yours that is suddenly, it's that sort of thing about killing your darlings, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's very, and then, but in this case, it's somebody else killing your darlings.
Yeah.
Which is even,
which feels even worse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I've often thought about that with like recording. If you're recording and you've got somebody who's sort of producing recording, you get that type of thing where you think, I don't see why that should happen.
What's it there for? And that's the tough question you have to ask yourself. What's it there for? Who's it there for? Is it there for your audience, or is it there for you?
Yeah, and that is one of the things, isn't it? It's that sort of thing of you doing something, like you said, when you started writing, you were writing for yourself.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that sort of thing of like, but now you're not writing for yourself, you're writing for somebody else. And that switch is really tricky.
Yeah.
It's still really writing, the story, it's your story. Well, it's come through you. But of course, it's aimed at somebody now, the reader. And it is actually very difficult, I think, as an artist, to be able to get that vision of what the audience see, because you're invested in it, aren't you?
Yeah, and it is a shift. It's a shifting of perspective. I think I'm getting a bit better at it. It helps, I think, to start when you're in the very, very early stages of an idea. That's the best time at which to start asking yourself those kind of challenging questions. If you're asking yourself too far down the line, then it becomes more of a wrench to make those changes. And everything feels a bit more complicated.
What would you say? Have you got a particular sort of thing that you could go, well, I've learned that whatever it is, because you were saying about characters, are they needed in the plot type of thing, or you sort of hinted at that. How are you sort of more aware of that now, where you look at something and think, well, if I just put that character in there because I like them.
Yeah, I'm dealing maybe I've learned nothing, because there's something I'm working on at the moment that's got a character in it I just love, and he's hilarious, and I've just got that nasty feeling that an editor somewhere down the line might just say, but he makes you laugh, but will necessarily work for a younger audience. So yeah, I don't know. I think just a lot of it comes in the planning, I think, for me now, and trying not to get too far down the line without really forcing myself to think about the reality of the story and the younger people who'll be reading it. So a good example of a character cut was in my second book, Our Castle by the Sea, which is a World War II story. And it's about two sisters growing up in a lighthouse. I live in Kent. It's a local story set on the White Cliffs of Dover.
Right.
Two sisters in a lighthouse there, and it's at the beginning of the Second World War. And originally, the two girls had an older sister. I beg your pardon. They had an older brother, Jules, who was a really good example of this. He was a character that I just loved. He was just kind of warm and funny, and he added a sort of he added humour to the book, and he was just sort of an attractive character. He was just a lovely kind of one of those characters that kind of lights up the whole thing a little bit. And my editor said, we've got to get rid of him. We've got to kill him off. We've got to get rid of him. I mean, not even kill him within the frame of the story, but I mean just cut him from the whole thing together. And it was horrible. It was a really, really difficult thing to do because I just really you do get quite attached to the characters when you're spending a lot of time with them writing stories. But she was absolutely right, because as soon as we took him out of the story, he left this great big hole, which the girls then, and it's the younger girl that's the main character, the girls had to fill this gap. So they had to be bigger and bolder characters. They didn't have anyone there to sort of step in and save the day. So it increased the sort of the tension, the danger, the suspense, the sense of vulnerability, and so the whole kind of the stakes went up. Basically, it became a much more gripping story, and it absolutely worked. But I do sometimes think in a slightly sort of whimsical way, think about these characters that I've cut, on what celestial plane they might perhaps still exist.
Yes,
I did that quite early on. I came up with a method to help me deal with big cuts, and that was to create a scrapyard document. And I don't know if this might work. This might work for other other media as well. But so scrapyard was, so instead of cutting and deleting all this stuff, I would cut and paste. So I'd paste it sideways into my scrapyard document, and then at least I felt that these things they weren't being eliminated, they weren't being deleted forever. So that was a way I dealt with it. Sorry, go on.
Something new.
Have I what?
I was going to say, these characters, could they become part of a new story?
So could they be recycled? I've never recycled a character. Moments I have, and phrases, those little darlings that we were talking about, those little moments that we think, oh, that's a lovely turn of phrase, that's a lovely bit, and those I've frequently found new homes for, in a way that works, but never a character so far. No.
Yeah, because I often say to people when with the songwriting, you might have to take something out. In fact, you generally do have to take something out, but that could sometimes you've got more than one song.
Yeah, absolutely. You're trying to do too much.
Yes, well, a lot of people do, don't they? I mean, there's a couple of obviously a couple of classic songs that have got obviously more than one song in a song. It doesn't happen very often. I'm quite intrigued by this because. Do you have a sort of are you sort of inspired by particular ways of writing?
Yeah, I think so. And in some of which would probably be on a conscious level, and most of which I'd say is probably completely unconscious.
Yes.
Just from a lifetime of having absorbed and assimilated all these stories. So ones that I'm particularly aware of, the children's books by Frances Hodgson Burnett. So The Secret Garden, particularly, I feel like is a sort of it's a literary blueprint for me of a sort of a perfect children's story. And I used to have that on an audiobook when I was little. I used to have it on cassette. I'd listen to it every night as I went to sleep. It would go that sort of that clunk when it got to the end of the tape. It would wake me up. I'd fall asleep listening to it for months, for years probably. I'd fall asleep listening to that story, and I just think it kind of it's seeped into my unconscious brain. Yeah, and I just think it's brilliant, and there are elements of that story that I'm conscious of coming back to thematically. I love the use of the Gothic genre in it, the sort of this remote mansion with all the locked doors and the hidden secrets within it, and the ability for a children's story to deal with big ideas like grief. Nature's really important, and it's something that I come back to in my writing, and something that is a big part of my philosophy as a children's writer, which is that there has to be hope. That there has to be hope there, and that's something that adult writers can, or writers for adult audiences rather, can, if they, depending on their mood, depending on the story, they don't necessarily have to include. But I really think it's I really believe it's so important in writing books for children that there is some light there balancing the darkness. There is some hope. So yeah, I think The Secret Garden's there. I think all those, adventure books that we would all devour as kids, all the famous 5 type stories. There's a lingering awareness of those. But I'm influenced by quite a few adult audience authors. So Daphne du Maurier, we have a kind of there's a dollop of du Maurier in my books, particularly then my third book, Ghost of Goswater, is a ghost story, and there's also some Wuthering Heights in that as well. So yeah. I do, and I taught secondary school English for 15 years, and there's definitely a part of me when I'm writing, I'm thinking about making those connections, that sort of intertextuality, making those little kind of clever connections that I know that students of mine in the past would have loved, kind of spotting those little moments and those allusions. So that's all in there. And you end up with this kind of sometimes like a tapestry of connections throughout literature. And I'm sure it's the same with music as well, that you can't help but reference, consciously or unconsciously.
That is absolutely true. And maybe that's just an artistic thing anyway, isn't it? Because it's a language. I know, obviously, you're using language, but any form of art is a language of some form, which means that there are certain, syntax and style and phraseology that you have if you're playing. Obviously, from the musical point of view, if you're playing something that's blues, you're referencing how somebody else phrased things for the blues, whatever that. And that must be obviously with literature, that you can phrase things in a particular way that references Jane Austen, what I mean.
I was talking to some students about this recently, because they were having to create a I think it's like a genre study kind of a piece, and some of them were really struggling with the idea of referencing a text without that temptation of plagiarizing, without actually just sort of nicking stuff. How do you? And there's a subtle line, isn't there? Really, between the two, and some of them also found it quite almost disheartening in a way, just because there is an awareness of all this vast body of work that has come before you, and a feeling that all the ideas that are worth exploring have already been explored, and so you're bound to tread on someone's toes kind of here and there. And I think what I was trying to encourage them to see was that you can make these references, and you can take a moment that feels like an echo, but provided you are taking it somewhere new and doing something fresh with it, then that's what's important. That's what matters.
Yes. I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's like there are only, whatever it is, only so many stories.
Depending on who you talk to, 5, I don't know, something or 6.
But it's like everything, isn't it? It's like, you can see references in your own life to things, can't you?
That's
that's some sort of synchronicity, or it's some sort of it's almost like you're playing out. We do it with our own families, don't we? If you think about it, your own life, and you can say, "My dad did that." And in a way, that's the type of thing. It's not exactly the same event, but there is a similarity in an event.
And it's nice. I think it's nice, isn't it? Because it gives us a sense of belonging, and it gives us a sense of the, you know, these patterns across history. And I think it works like that in art as well. It makes us, with our artistic identity.
It does, and I think that's one of the things about being able to get the sort of long view on stuff. And obviously, when you like you were saying about talking to students about that, and they can have that sort of overwhelming thing of like, well, what's the point? You know,
yeah,
all the great stories have been written, or all the great songs have been written, or you know, how can you create a new melody with only this handful of notes? Because you've got somebody to say that's my tune.
Yeah,
and in a way, you've got to be brave enough to say, well, it's now mine. But you know, because you've put it in a context. Because that's this is an interesting thing, I think. A lot of things that we don't spot is context. You know, we get the detail. You know, that tune is almost the replica of that one, but contextually it might not be. Might be very, very different. And again, the same thing with stories. I'm assuming.
Yeah, and even just, you know, the slightest shift in nuance can make something completely different.
Exactly. And I think that's another thing, that's because we tend to come at things very intellectually in this society, don't we? But a lot of those sort of things are not intellectual. They tend to be more subliminal. It's that, you know, natural thing that you sort of think, well, it's not until you sort of look at the broader picture that you sort of go, oh yeah, hang on a minute. Yeah, that might be, you know, it's a resetting of, I know people have done this anyway, haven't they? How many times has Romeo and Juliet been written?
Yeah.
But not as the Shakespearean setting. You know, you can look at that and go, well, it's basically the same story. And again, I think that's another thing, isn't it? When, as you write and you create, you start to discover those type of things, I think.
Yeah, and but also to see those connections. If you know, you start working an idea and you think, oh, but that, you know, oh yeah, but Shakespeare did. but to see it as an opportunity rather than a dead end, and to think, okay, so where am I going with it?
Exactly.
And what am I bringing to it that's new? Where's the unburnt wood in this bit? You know, it's not all a pile of ashes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's like when people sort of get disheartened, like when they sort of teach you songwriting, you go, well, that's very similar to so-and-so. And you go, different. Yeah. No, that's good. If somebody's listening to something and thinks that you sound as good as that, that's good. Now you need to, now you're aware of that. How do you use that? And I think that's one of the, you know, again, it's like, well, you know, and it is that, going back to the thing about writing for yourself and writing for other people. And it is that fine balance, because you've got to enjoy doing what you do, obviously. Because you wouldn't want to do it, would you, anymore?
No.
So you were saying about the thing of actually going from writing because you want to write to it being the thing that you do.
Yeah.
The transitional thing then.
Yeah.
What did you find difficult?
I think the biggest thing is something that I'm actually probably now quite evangelical about, which is a commercial awareness. And I think when you are doing something, a creative pursuit for the love of it, I think it's easy to think of those kind of commercial forces as being, you think of it in quite a black and white sense, and a bit kind of, you know, that's the dark side.
Yes.
I'm a creative Jedi, and that's the dark side. And I think, but I don't think it's not that black and white, is it? And if you want to make money out of doing what you love, then it's just the reality of it that you do need to.
You have to talk with the devil. Yeah, exactly.
You do. But it doesn't have to be like that. And I think I did see it as, you know, kind of selling out. I saw it as, you know, but now I'm much more practical about it. And actually, I enjoy the creative challenge of it, of thinking, okay, so what is it that that my publisher is after, what sort of a story are they after, what's what the direction that the market is going in, and having an awareness of that, and an awareness of what I can do within that, that is still true to me and true to what I love doing, and my artistic style, and the ideas that I'm interested in exploring. And that in itself is a really exciting creative challenge. How, where do I meet the market in the middle? How can I do something that is the authentic for me, that isn't just selling out, and isn't just ticking various boxes, something that's authentic for me artistically, but that is also something that my publisher is going to get excited about in terms of if they can sell it. So yeah, I think that's probably been a big shift. That's been the biggest shift for me, that changing my outlook on those commercial forces, I think.
Yeah, because I mean, I always sort of talk to people who, like kids who are learning to play the guitar, and they're obviously keen to do something with music. And I have to sort of have this sort of thing about, one of the problems is that this thing started as a hobby, and then it has to become a business.
Yeah.
Then there is a mindset shift where you have to start thinking about if I do this, how much more will that bring in? If you sort of that sort of business thing,
Yeah. And also just that the admin. Like a student I was talking to yesterday, I did like a careers talk about making a living out of creative in the creative industry, and she said, how much of your time do you actually spend writing? And I thought about it. I reckon probably in terms of my working hours, about half or less is actually the writing and the editing, and there's about must be 50% or more that's admin, and then all the other things like literature festivals and school visits and interviews and articles and all that.
Marketing.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is,
and
totally.
So probably less than half my working time, I think. And it's fun, and it feels sometimes, some weeks, it feels like the writing has got to fit in around the edges of everything else, which is crazy, isn't it? But
it is
not ideal.
No, it isn't. But and again, that's another problem. Obviously, a lot of creative people have, is that they can create the thing, but they can't sell it.
Yeah.
Which of course is no good if you're trying to make some money out of it.
Yeah.
And it is actually very difficult to, especially if it's your thing, to say to somebody, well, here it is, and no one can the money for it.
I think that's a really big thing. And I also think, I don't know if this is a horrible generalization of creative types like us, but we're not always that attuned to that more businessy financial way of looking at things, because our brains are immersed in the creative side of it so much of the time. But it's hard. It's sometimes really, really hard. I sometimes feel like you've got to sort of put on different hats and play all these different roles, and to make it.
That's a really good point. I think it's a really good point. It is the case of, in fact, Edward de Bono, who did the lateral thinking thing, did a book called, I think it was The Six Thinking Hats or something.
Thinking hats. Yeah. I remember that. Yeah.
And I mean, there is that sort of thing, the changing the persona, like the actor type of thing, of becoming another character. And I think that's really important. And again, if you think about somebody who's a good salesman, they probably know what's wrong with the thing they're selling, but they don't tell the person. But they're very good at telling, expounding the wonderfulness of whatever. And that's actually really difficult to do, isn't it, as a person? Because then you say how wonderful you are. Because it really is what art is about. It's like you created this thing and it's your thing. And then you've got to sort of
And actually, there's another sort of a dichotomy, which is that a lot of creative industries, writing, fine art, a lot of music, not necessarily all music, but lots of music, is actually a very the creating, the composing is a very introverted process. And this flip side of it that we're talking about now, the more commercial side of it, when I go into schools, for example, or talking at literature festivals, that's an extrovert. And and just switching from, sometimes it might be weak. In lockdown, it was months of just me and my laptop, and that sitting in my pajamas and creating. And then having to switch to being, charming and entertaining, and this is what my book's about. And it's weird. It's a very, very weird thing, and it can be very difficult. And not everyone can do both. And also, it wasn't always like that. Well, I don't think so. Maybe I've got a, I don't know. But I have the feeling that in the past, writers could just be sort of left alone in their garret with their quill and their canvas.
I think there was an element. I think there was an element of people being just left alone to do and their work being sold by somebody.
By somebody else, yeah.
We've still got that idea that publishers do that for you, but obviously you've got to do a lot of work yourself now, haven't you?
Yeah.
In
fact, it's in most writers' contracts that they have to be part of the marketing.
Exactly. Whereas I think if you went back to, I don't know, James Joyce, for instance, I don't think Joyce would have been very good at selling his stuff.
Going into school.
Somebody say, look, this guy's a genius, and just trust me, the guy's a genius. Buy the book. It's a limited edition.
Yeah.
And I think that must have been true of. I mean, okay, Dickens is a different.
Yeah, he was on stage, wasn't he? He was.
Yeah, he's a different character, but
he is. Yeah.
I think a lot of those writers, they wouldn't have been able to have marketed.
No. Poetry is a good case in point, I think, for that.
Yes.
It's a very, very introspective way of working creatively. I mean, I suppose one of the things that I haven't really thought about here is that some of these pursuits are much more solitary. So writing, first draft writing is very, very solitary, and then when I start working with editors, it's a slightly different process. More of a conversation, I suppose, but not the same as working with a group of other musicians, for example, which I think adds a very different dynamic to the creative process, doesn't it? Then when you've got several minds.
Yeah, it does. And obviously, then you have the problem if somebody becomes quite dominant. Or if there are significant, what do they call it, musical differences. Well, musical differences means that you can get on with somebody, but that's code.
But he was a right so and so.
No, that's just an epithet for you can't stand the other person. I think what happens with that is it's very difficult to be able to step back enough from the work. Again, with this sort of thing, it's obvious that there are lots of stories about songs that became the thing that made a band or made an artist, and it wasn't them that realised that was the great song. That happens a lot. Like for instance, just a couple just plucked out of the air. Billy Joel's "Just the Way You Are" was, this classic song. He thought it was rubbish, and the band thought it was rubbish. It was actually Linda Ronstadt that came in and said, "I love that song. It's the best thing you do." And they couldn't believe that. Santana's "Samba Party" they thought was rubbish. The whole band, it was just the manager that thought it was really good. And the other one was Roxanne by the Police. It was actually Miles Copeland that really pushed that to be a single.
Yeah, it is really interesting, isn't it?
It is,
and I wonder if that comes down to partly that the creatives are wrapped up in the the fine detail of their work, and then you have someone outside with the bigger picture and the commercial awareness.
That brings you back to the idea of what you're saying about the editor, coming in and saying, look, you've got to get rid of that character.
I think it's also a sense that when you're creating something, there often is you can't see the wood for the trees. You're so close to it that actually sometimes you're not the best person to make judgments. And I was talking to a writer yesterday we were talking about genre, and she was talking about fantasy genre and whether some of my stuff is fantasy genre and whether I set out to write fantasy. And it's sort of, I kind of skirt about historical fantasy, magical realism, sort of somewhere around that kind of ballpark. But when I set out to write a book, I'm never thinking, okay, what genre is this? The story is the story, and the genre is just a label that someone sticks on it afterwards, really. So it's it's something that I don't necessarily. I'm too close to it, really. In fact, I'm within it. I can't really make those kind of calls, those kind of judgments.
So I want to go back to something you said earlier, about when you won the competition, the writing competition. Did you know that you were in with a chance to win that, or did you just sort of think, well, let's just do that? I
had done a bit of research on the agent who I knew was, so this is perhaps the birth of my commercial awareness. The agent who was judging it, I had been to hear him talk about things that he thought about the industry and so on. And I had just been I'd thought about that for a long time. And so I did enter the competition with, it was an idea that I was playing with anyway, but I think probably I did have half an eye, if you like, on creating something that I knew might be his cup of tea, something that he might notice. But I certainly had no idea of if, I suppose, how good it was in the context of all the other entries that they must have been reading. And I do think the longer I'm in this industry, the more I think the competitions are essentially nonsensical when it comes to anything artistic whatsoever. So you get all these books shortlisted for an award. Well, it was Brits last night, wasn't it? But you get all these. Yeah, so you get books shortlisted for award, and in a way that's enough, because it's enough just to say, these are some of the great books. These are some of the great, the really good books that have happened this year, or whatever. But to pick one out of books that are completely different genres, aimed at completely, different readership, that it's absolute nonsense, isn't it? When you pick that apart and you go, and that's just one person, or a panel of judges. It's just, and it's a very, very odd thing. And yet we set such store by it, don't we? This was the costume, this was the Man
Booker and all that sort of stuff.
Man Booker, it's we really do. We hold these awards. They have so much prestige, and yet really it's just so much of it. It's just
but again, that's
arbitrary is the word I'm not.
Yeah, but it's all part of the marketing machine, isn't it? It's that sort of thing of public awareness, and the fact that somebody can go, I'm putting, we're sponsoring this, aren't we good? And there's that side of it. And then, of course, all the bookshops want that, because it's like they can put that book in the window, and it sort of piques people's interest, because some sort of panel of experts have said this is a really great book.
This is good,
And so really, again, that's sort of not really anything to do with art at all.
No.
marketing. But again, it's back to that thing of patronage, isn't it? It's, if you go back to the time when to be an artist, you had to be patronized by somebody. Somebody had to give you some money.
Yeah.
So really, it's the same sort of thing, but in another guise. All I need to say about that from the musical point of view is the X Factor. And again, that's quite good for some people, but it's not going to be the thing that makes it work for you. I mean, it's good for some people to go and do it and say that they've been on it. Because again, it's like you're saying, once you've been on the list, that might be enough.
Yeah.
To get you, head above everybody else's.
It is a very odd thing, isn't it? And then and there's so many things that there are various kind of zeitgeisty boxes that people want to tick and show that we're that various trends are kind of, I don't know, are being acknowledged. There's all sorts of politics.
Oh my God!
In these things, aren't there?
About this, shouldn't we? The politics, politically correct, whatever, in literature, especially with children's, young adults and all the rest of it, must be a minefield.
There's been a huge shift within the last few years. A huge shift, and a big and very, very necessary change in the wake of the Black Lives Matter campaign, and people realizing just how white middle class dominated the publishing industry was. Sort of looking around and going, oh, we all look the same. We all went to the same school.
Yes,
I'm exaggerating, but and so absolutely something absolutely needed. And I you go into schools and you think every kid, every one of these kids should be able to see themselves as a hero in a story. It shouldn't be the case that there are so many children feeling that feeling excluded because of the way it had this, these sort of traditions in the world of publishing, the way in which have been so white middle class dominated. So there absolutely needed to be a significant landslide in that respect, and big changes, and this the pursuit of the own voices, stories, has been really, really important, and a really good thing, and a real breath of fresh air in the publishing industry. But then at its extremity, there is that increasing argument, and this is something that I've seen actors speaking out about as well. This sense that to what extent are we allowed to use our imagination to take on the role of someone who is of a different background, and so that there are writers now thinking, well, I really, really want to have a main character who is from a different culture from me, a different ethnic background from me. How do I go about this? And there's that has all become quite a difficult thing now. And there's a sort of fear, I think, in terms of publishing, and particularly when it comes to I suppose racial identity and gender identity as well, is something that people have become so much more aware of now. Again, all for the good, but there is a fear. There is a sort of a quaking fear amongst the commissioning editors of doing something that's going to be wrong, or that's going to offend people or step on people's toes. And so there's a sort of a conservatism in a way that's a bit anti-imagination. Yeah, I think there's a sort of the fear of the insurance claim, or the fear of the legal aspects of stuff. And in fact, because for a long time, this is the thing that's been keeping
how society is being sort of manipulated and massaged, right? I mean, I'll give you an example of this. There's a musical equipment, right? There's this idea that you need to have it pat tested. Now, pat testing is somebody comes in, whatever, and you think, okay, but that doesn't really prove anything as such, because the thing will go wrong and all the rest of it. But people think it's a legal requirement, but it's not. It's an insurance requirement. It's not legal.
So it's an anti-litigation requirement, essentially, is it?
Yeah, well, there's this idea that things are sort of done through the back door because you couldn't make that a law. But it's such a way that because it's an insurance requirement, you've got to get it done.
Yeah.
So I think what happens is there's a sort of a creeping feeling that there's a restriction happening. And this, when people look at things and they're frightened to do they could put their foot in it. And obviously comedians have had this problem for quite some time.
Yeah.
Because they can't just tell a joke because they will offend somebody. And sometimes it can be like they can seriously offend somebody. And you think, well, at one level, that's good. But on another level, it's not.
Yeah.
And there's a very difficult situation where you think, because in an ideal world, we don't want that. We don't want to offend people. We don't. But unfortunately, what it does is there's another sort of counterbalance that gets affected, which then becomes problematic because people can't say things.
Yeah. Or explore, creatively things that they might otherwise have been interested in.
Which we do need to think about.
Yeah.
And because again, it's like everything, isn't it? Things aren't, as you said before, they're not black and white.
No, and I think that the problem isn't the, as you say, the problem isn't the movement itself in terms of a greater awareness of each other and an increased diversity and increased richness in the voices coming through and being represented. That's the good side of it all, absolutely. But the problem is, as you say, this kind of trepidation, this kind of the censorship that this kind of creeps into the edges of that. But I was talking to an editor about this recently, and she had a really, really interesting perspective on it. And she was saying it's just a pendulum swing. It's all it is. It's a pendulum swing. The pendulum has been at that end of things for so long. It's just swung right up the other way, and it'll just take a little while for it to.
It's funny actually, because I did
in a sane place in the middle.
I did a podcast a little while ago about how you get. It was about I called it about desire. This sort of thing, or motivation. Because we call things motivation, but really it's desire. It's the thing that makes people want to do that thing, right? And I was saying that, it's interesting about how it's always been society tries to dampen certain aspects about desire. You go back to the church and it was like, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, and so on. But of course, that goes through those type of pendulum swings. Because if you look at, medieval period, there was a certain, it was difficult to dampen down the whole of society, but then you get that sort of period where you get like the puritanical period of time. And it went out of that into the sort of Reformation, which was like chaos from a point of view of morals. And then it sort of swung back again, so you get the type of the Victorian period and it's all a bit like, well to do, and so on. So you think, well, I agree with her totally, that if you sort of, again, stand back, look, there are these sort of recurring cycles of things, of behaviour, ways of thinking, what people believe in. It all just keeps going round and round in circles. Interesting, I think.
Yeah, it is. And tricky to have that that view, you know, that to be able to see the big picture when you're kind of stuck in the middle of it all. But yeah, it does. I think it does help to think of that historical context.
Yes,
and just hope we're heading towards a better life of everything. I'm thinking about everything at the moment, to be honest. Political situation, and everything. We just have to hope we're heading towards somewhere better.
We hope. That's like in your books. You said you've got to have a little glimmer of optimism.
Yeah, there has to be a glimmer of light in the darkness. Yeah,
exactly. So you said you're just publishing your 6th book?
My 5th book's just come out. So that's a book called The Mermaid in the Mill Pond, and it's a little one. So my first 4 books were with a lovely children's publisher called Chicken House. Yeah. Who they were run by Barry Cunningham, who was J.K. Rowling's first editor at Bloomsbury, and then he set up Chicken House, his own publishing house. And I'm still with them for my main middle grade novels. That's what we call them. Books aimed at like 9 to 12 mainly. And then I've just done this book, Mermaid in the Mill Pond, for a publisher called Barrington Stoke, and they do these beautiful, really, really carefully, intelligently produced and published books but they're just very, very inclusive. So they're meant to be they are dyslexia friendly, right? Printed on off-white paper, and they've got illustrations and
that's brilliant.
And we do like really kind of just sort of really thoughtful language edits, and the font and everything. They think about everything to make them the books as accessible as possible for youngsters with dyslexia, but also just for children who struggle to get into books, or reluctant readers, kids who've never really felt like books are their thing. But Barrington Stoke are just sorry, I don't mean to say this into a plug for Barrington Stoke, but I believe in them. They're just wonderful. They're so wonderful, because they're that moment when a kid who's always felt that books are for the clever kids, books are for someone else, books aren't for me, for them to have a book that they can devour it in a night. They can go into school the next day and go, "Miss, I read a whole book last night," and suddenly it could be their thing. If they wanted to do their thing, it could be their thing. So I think they're really life-changing. They're really, really lovely publisher. I've been really excited working for them, and it's a really different process too. So my usual my children's books are usually about 50 to 60,000 words long, and this The Mermaid in the Mill Pond is just 8,000 words. And they said to me, "Do you reckon you can get all your kind of signature ingredients, all the bit of the historical mystery, that kind of bit of supernatural magic bubbling away beneath the surface, and get all of that into 8,000?" And a really twisty plot as well. Like, okay, I'll give it a go. And so it was a really, really exciting thing to do, and I had to think about my writing in a completely different way. I had to think about structure in a completely different way. And it was a really, really good challenge for me, and really satisfying, because it was something that I could do much more swiftly and painlessly than one of my bigger books.
Like short stories or shorter stories, it's really quite difficult to do.
It's a really, really different thing, and I think of it in after I studied at university, I went to drama school because I thought I wanted to be an actor. So I trained at drama school for a year, and worked as an actor for a few years. I discovered that I didn't really like performance. I had terrible stage fright. I didn't really enjoy the performance. What I enjoyed was the rehearsal process. I enjoyed playing with the characters, the dynamics between the characters, and creating character voice, and exploring the subtlety in the language and exploding the subtext. And that was what I loved. And with hindsight now, I can see it's just that it was me as a storyteller. That's what I enjoyed. I enjoyed that process. But I learned a lot about beats, about dramatic beats, and pacing, and that sense of the dramatic within a scene. And a lot of that feeds into my into my work. And so when I was working on The Mermaid in the Mill Pond, I was thinking, well, I've just got to get those beats closer together. I've just got to get it. It's just going to obviously beats in literature and in theatres, it's slightly different from your musical.
No, but it's, in a way, it is the same thing. It's knowing when the phrase falls. It's that.
Yeah,
isn't it? And you can't. It's a feeling thing. You know.
Yeah. It is. It is absolutely.
You got it right. And it's brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. Apart from that, obviously that beginning was a bit
well, technical struggle, but then it made it all the more worthwhile. You see.
Yeah, exactly, because it was the most bizarre thing. I could hear you, you couldn't hear me, but the signal reading was correct. But I don't know.
Yeah.
So we had a few sort of aborted attempts at trying to connect up another way, and so on. But we got there. Brilliant.
It was the mountain we had to climb. There we go.
It was, exactly. Thanks ever so much, Lucy. That was wonderful.
Well, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
That's great. So I'll put your contact stuff on the show notes. So if you just want to send me some links and stuff.
Yeah, sure. I'll send you a link. I'll send you a link to my website and one to my book books for sale as well. Just
do
anyone wants to have a browse.
Yeah, no, that'd be lovely, because as I say, it's one of those things. I think certainly people write for children is, certainly in the last, I don't know, what would you say? Well, obviously J.K. Rowling, but before that, it was almost a new thing. Well, not a new thing, but you know what I mean. It was
there was absolutely a revolution in it. There really, really was.
Yeah.
I think they talk about this being a golden age of children's literature, and I don't think it's an exaggeration. I think
it is.
I think it's a really extraordinary time to be a young bookworm. Yeah,
because the actual books are fantastic stories. It's not just it's not just a. It's not just well, I was going to say Enid Blyton, but you know what I mean. It's not just
the substance in them, and the care that goes into create. They're things of beauty as well, aren't they? The beautiful cover designs and everything. There's just I think it's there's really real value placed on them now, which is wonderful.
Yes. I totally agree with you. Yeah, lovely. Well, that was good. Thank you ever so much.
Well, that was my pleasure, Vic. Right, I'll
what you doing?
I'll sign out and I'll
Yeah, send me you've got to send me the recording.
I'll send you the recording. Now he's hoping I don't balls that up.
No, it'll be fine. It'll be good. All right. So see you again soon.
Here we go. Thanks, Vic. Take care.
And you. Bye.
Bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview as much as I did. I always think it's interesting when you see somebody who's involved in a sort of artistic, sort of an adjacent artistic capacity. You often see the type of problems that you have to deal with your own creativity, often with a slightly different sort of viewpoint, which I think is brilliant. So thanks to Lucy for that. And check out her work. Obviously, all the stuff's on the show notes. And until next time, I'll see you then. Bye.